Hi everybody, welcome to the Mean and Mighty Writing Machine series. I'm Eric LaFountain. For part 2, I want to give you some ideas on how to get started with your papers and how to break that one-size-fits-all introduction dilemma. If you're anything like me, you've probably had a number of papers over your academic career that you've started pretty much the same way. So I want to give you some fresh ideas so that you don't dread going to the computer when you get that new assignment. You don't fall into that trap where you feel like you have to start every paper the exact same way. So the first intro type that you can try out is probably the one that you're most familiar with, the inverted triangle introduction. Just because it's the most common and what you know the best, it doesn't mean that's a bad thing. Just be aware that you've likely begun most of your papers this way. So as you'll see from my very high-tech graphic here, the upside-down triangle, it starts broadly. So the writer starts with a general statement about the topic. And I'll give you a student writer example of this, who I thought she did a really good job with it. She was writing a paper about K-12 education, and she opened up her work stating that right now K-12 education is flawed because it's all about teaching to the test and doing well on grades, and it's not really about turning students into critical thinkers. So it's a very broad general statement about the system. And then she moved on and she narrowed her focus, and she gave a name to this mentality. She called it the banking concept, where students just kind of store information like they're saving it in a bank, and then when it comes time to cash out for the test, they take it out and they put it down, they get that good grade, they move on, and it's a very shallow experience. So she got a little narrow as she went down, a little narrower as she went down to the middle. And then the very last step, if you were right in front of me and I asked this, you'd likely shout it out. What do we do at the very end of the triangle? We need to give the reader the thesis statement. And she did that really well. She argued that education, K-12, they need to wean themselves off that banking mentality and design more activities that turn students into better thinkers and stronger writers. Not just about doing well on a test, not just about memorizing facts. So maybe you've done this before. My guess is you have. That doesn't mean it's a bad thing. But what if you're sick of this? What if you want to do something different? Let's check out the next example. Intro type number 2, the narrative introduction. A lot of students like this style because it's fun. The narrative introduction uses a short story to coax readers into taking an interest, and it sets the stage for your argument. So some pros. It's fresh. It's a creative way to begin your work and grab your readers early on, but there's also a downside to the narrative introduction if it isn't used correctly. If your story is too long and it doesn't clearly connect to your argument, your readers are likely to lose interest and check out, and they're not going to follow you into the real meat of your paper. So you really need to strike that balance between creative and fresh and making sure that it doesn't go on so long that your readers are just confused. They don't know what's going on. A student example, I had a student who was writing a paper about women boxing programs, and she did this really well. In the opening of her paper, she described prepping for a match. She was in the gym, she's doing push-ups, she's lifting weights, she's sparring with her partner, and we just got dropped right into that world. We were in the gym right alongside her. After that brief narrative introduction, though, she opened the paper up and she showed us what the real focus was going to be about these programs, about how difficult it is to get young women interested in them, about how hard it is to keep them financially afloat, but also all the benefits that can come when young women join these programs early on. So you can see how the story, it was fresh, it was cool, I wanted to keep reading, but it didn't go on so long where it was just, what's happening here? Right after that intro, it fed seamlessly into the real meat of her paper. So keep that in mind with the narrative introduction. You want to make sure that you strike that balance. The next type of introduction, the interrogative introduction. So instead of beginning with a story, the interrogative introduction opens your paper with a question. But the question has to cover a lot of ground. So if you do use this style, keep the following things in mind. It needs to introduce your topic, it needs to interest your readers, and it also needs to give your readers a sense of what you're going to focus on as your work continues. That's a lot that question has to accomplish. But I'll give you an example here of a writer who did it well. She began her work, to what extent do women and men who work in different occupations also work in different spaces? Right away, I said, I want to read this paper. Just based on this question, I'm interested in it. The writer's challenging me to think about this right alongside her. And I also know what she's going to get into as her paper continues. Women, men, the workplace. And after this question, she went into the larger, she tried to answer this, in other words. And for her, I guess the main gist was women and men in certain industries, when they don't have a lot of contact, it can be damaging to both genders. But it was this question that grabbed me. I wanted to learn more about this topic. I got thinking about it early on, and I also knew what I was in for as a reader right from that first sentence. So the interrogative introduction, it's deceptively simple, right? Okay, yeah, I can come up with a question, but you really need to make sure that your question is covering all your bases here. So be careful there. It's a fun way to introduce it. It's an interesting, fresh way, but make sure that it introduces your topic, gets your readers wanting to read, but also gives them a sense of what you're going to dig into as your paper progresses. The next style of intro, the paradoxical introduction. This might work for some of you, depending on the topic that you're focused on. But instead of opening with a question, now what you're doing is you're beginning with an assumption that readers accept as true, and then you're formulating a thesis that challenges that assumption and seems paradoxical. So let me translate that. Basically, what this boils down to, as I wrote down here, most people think this about X, but I'm going to show you something new that runs counter to your assumptions. So is there a topic out there, most people think this about the topic, but you know what? There's something else. I'm going to show you something new. Let's go for that ride instead. And I'll give you another example of a student writer who did this. Her main focus was the way we sound, the way we behave. Most people think that has to do with biology, right? It's just something that's built into our genes. That's why we sound the way we do. That's why we behave the way we do. That was the assumption she wanted to challenge. And she said, actually, I want to show you something totally different that might run counter, might seem paradoxical. It's mostly due to culture. In other words, what we absorb as we're walking around and listening to things, that influences the way we act and behave much more, or at least on par to the biology. And that was a really cool paper, right? Most people think this about it, but I'm going to show you something totally new, and I wanted to go for that ride, and it was a really interesting paper. So think about when you begin your work, depending on the topic, do you feel like most of society has assumptions about the topic that you can show them aren't necessarily true? There's something new. Bring them on that ride. I think this would be a really good introduction for a topic like that. The last style of intro, the minding the gap introduction. And again, this might be a really good fit depending on the topic that you're writing about. When using the minding the gap intro, the writer calls readers' attention to a gap in the research on an issue and then uses the rest of the essay to fill in the gap. So basically what you're doing is saying, wait a minute, there's something missing from this conversation and my research and ideas will fill in this gap. I don't think this will become apparent to you until you really get into the research process, right? You got to kind of get out and see what people are writing about, see what the conversation is. And as you learn more about the conversation, do you see any gaps? You know, nobody's looking at this part of the topic. I read a really cool paper a while back. It was actually, I think, written by two professional weightlifters. And they were looking at steroid use, and they wanted to write a scholarly research paper about steroids. But what they found as they entered the conversation was that most writers were only focused on professional athletes. So in other words, they were looking at Lance Armstrong, they were looking at Barry Bonds, they were looking at the motivations behind their behavior and the health consequences. But nobody, or very few writers at least, were focused on amateur athletes. In other words, we know why Lance and Barry Bonds, why they use steroids, but what's up with that guy down the street who goes to his local gym and he's juicing every week? Why does he do it? How does he get those drugs? And what are the health consequences of using them week in and week out? How much do they cost, etc.? There's this huge gap, and that's what they really focused on in their paper. And it was such a cool paper because of that. Nobody was going in that direction. They're really breaking new ground as researchers and writers. So again, depending on the topic, and as you get deeper into the research process, do you notice any gaps that maybe you can fill with your research and ideas? Or maybe it's just not so much a gap, but that not enough people are paying enough attention to it, right? You feel like it's worthy of more attention and you want to shed the spotlight on it. This would be a really good intro to begin with. So I hope now, after going through these different styles, you have some ideas, right? It doesn't always have to be the same. It doesn't have to start with that inverted triangle intro that you've probably done just by default over and over again. And when you do get excited about the intro, you start on a stronger foot, you get more excited about your paper, and that shows on the page, and your readers will take note of it, and they're going to want to follow you into the real body of your work. So make sure you start on a strong, fresh note, and think about which one of these introductions work best depending on the assignment you get. That's it for part 2 of the Mean and Mighty Writing Machine series. Stay tuned for part 3.